Welcome to another edition of AML Conversations. This is actually a crossover podcast. Our conversation will also be available. Marquette Center for Peacemaking is going to be doing a podcast series starting in 2026. So this conversation will also be part of that. And with me today is Dr. Gabe Velez. Dr. Velez, among other things, is an associate professor in educational policy and leadership and a coordinator of the Educational Policy and Foundation Program at Marquette University, also involved with the Center for Peacemaking. And I met Gabe a couple of months ago, and we've talked a couple of times since. He has just written a book that's out now. It's called Making Meaning of Justice and Peace, a Developmental Lens. While not directly related to the AML CFT field, it does have, I think, adjacencies that are important in terms of training the next generation of citizens of whatever jurisdiction and country in terms of the importance of things like justice and peace. And we're going to talk a bit about that. So, Gabe, let me start first. Again, thank you for taking the time. Can you tell us, I have interviewed Pat Kennelly, the director of the center. I've interviewed Tom Durkin, the associate director, in the past. Can you give us an update on your involvement with the Center for Peacemaking and talk a little bit about what the center does? And then I want to dive into your book.
Yeah, well, John, thanks for having me too. I really appreciate it. And I love this connection across the different folks at Center for Peacemaking because, we're all involved in obviously a number of projects and Pat oversees it all. But I think we do take these kind of like different approaches and lenses. I know Tom has a background in English and he focuses on the peace studies. I'm coming at it from a psychological lens. And I'm not from the New York I'm from the New York City area, not from the Milwaukee area. So I'm also, that's kind of an interesting part of it for me is learning about what's going on in the city. And so basically, when I first stepped foot on Marquette's campus, knowing that I was going to be an assistant professor, which was back in 2019, the Center for Peacemaking immediately seemed like a place for really good synergy. I'd been doing this work in Colombia. I'd been a teacher there. I did my dissertation that we'll talk about that kind of built into the book around peace and what peace meant to young people and the peace education work being done with them. And so really over the last 6 to 7 years, I've been working with the Center for Peacemaking on evaluating some of their programming, thinking about how do we get a sense of what kind of impact it's having, and doing this in a way too that really isn't just about measuring kind of like pre and post, like do we see a change, do we see these peace skills being built, but really thinking of it a little bit broadly about like, is it serving the needs that folks are seeing, right? How are they applying this in their context in their lives? How is it addressing the needs that they face in these areas in Milwaukee where they're dealing with kind of real challenges? And so concretely, that means, working with Sherry Walker is the associate director on some of the research and evaluation that they do for programs with Milwaukee Public Schools that are these restorative therapeutic approaches to handling student behavioral concerns. And then I helped the Center for Peacemaking develop a peace education toolkit that's now being used in a number of different schools as well.
The notion of peace studies is so important. As we're recording this in the U.S., there's a massive debate going on about the attacks of the Venezuelan boats. We're not going to dive into that. We'll leave that to other experts. But I looked at what you wrote, and when I was able to go get through the book, not that it was hard to get through, but obviously it was an area that I wasn't that generally aware of, that it seems so important that the youth of today, whichever characterization you want, and I don't know the different buckets of millennials, and all that, but just starting early like you're doing, importance of opening up students' understanding of peace and justice. But what I also was interested in early on in the book, you talk about both accountability for mistakes. Again, my assessment, I'm not being specific to how you covered this, but also how discipline. Talk a little. I know, to me that was interesting because, when students cause issues, whatever they may be, it looks from the research that you've seen, if you handle discipline in a certain way, the chances of success of that particular student increase versus if you handle discipline a different way. Talk a little bit about that part of the book.
Yeah, I guess I'll start with saying I think sometimes in schools, and there are a million reasons we could spend hours talking about this, but in schools we focus on either the short-term kind of repercussions or impacts or what we're doing, or if they're long-term, they're usually very academic. And so you'll see a lot of research in that sense that's about, we try this intervention, we try this programming, are we making an impact right away? Or if we look long-term on like grades or SAT scores or college admission, like are we making a change? And all of those things matter. But I think, what I was sort of trying to get at in the book and trying to broaden the perspective a bit to say, well, there's other ways to think about interventions in schools where it's, are we making a change on the ways that young people see themselves in the world and they interact with others? And that's really powerful because, linking into, I think, areas of focus for you and the audience, that's really where I think the foundations for pro-social engagement, for thinking through ethical questions, and then, into like committing yourself to being engaged or rejecting violent behaviors as well. That's where that starts. Because if you see yourself, for instance, in the school as the type of person who is valued, who's supported, who has a community, who belongs, you may be facing, let's say, gang violence out in the community or even gang recruitment as a young student. And I had students back in the day when I was a teacher in Harlem where this was a real issue. But you're also less likely then to engage in that because you have a different community, you have another sense of belonging. And so, sort of applying that, thinking about that, particularly with restorative justice, where a lot of times it gets talked about is like, can we deal with making there be fewer suspensions in schools? And like, great, I think that matters, right? When we send kids home, for a day because they're suspended, there's just lots of negative impacts. We think we're making the school safer, to your point, but we're not really. And there's a lot of good evidence that we're not making it safer, but we're also not helping that kid in understanding what it means to be a part of a community, to heal when you make harm. And, we're pushing them out. And when we push them out, that's going to make them much more open to thinking of, to be sort of embracing with the extremist kind of views that may be out there that may take them in. And I've written a little bit about this, but I think there is a link to say something like restorative justice builds a sense of belonging and connection to education, which often means to the state, to your community, to other people in a way that helps create the relationships and bonds that prevent radicalization.
So how do you define restorative justice? What's your definition?
Yeah, so for me, the definition really is about centering relationships and centering particularly relationships around respect and trust and a recognition that we are all kind of like people and we want to share in that space kind of equally and build that community. And so, sometimes again, people think of restorative justice as only the responses to harm. So when you look at the justice system, you hear about restorative justice and you think someone who stole something from someone else or who harmed someone else, they have to make up for that in some way. Or you think about a societal level, you look at South Africa, Rwanda, Colombia, and it's about how do we build back a sense of community altogether. But it really begins too with the stuff that you're doing before all that, and particularly in schools. It's building that community, building a sense of belonging, making students feel that they're respected, that they're heard, they're part of their school. And again, I think to me, the value of that is not just about they're going to be engaged in their school and do better in their academics, but it's also a sense of I belong to something in a community. And that's one of our core institutions in our societies, our school and education. So it sets that groundwork for then feeling like I belong to this society. I belong to this community. I'm going to be invested in its safety and its well-being and the well-being of others.
How do you handle as an educator that goal when particularly now we see these excessive use of pardonings by the president of people that have been drug traffickers and bribery and corruption? In our world, in the AML space, we have seen just in the past couple of weeks a number of individuals, whether it's George Santos or whether it's the former president of Honduras, who've committed financial crime, money laundering crimes, don't seem that remorseful. Again, these are adults; these aren't children, students,
Sure.
And they're getting pardoned. So, as an educator, obviously, as you try to persuade and educate the younger generation on the importance of engagement and all the things that you talked about, being a good citizen, how difficult do you think, and not that you have to deal with it specifically, but maybe your peers do, how difficult does that seem to be given the environment we're in, not just in the States. We saw what happened in Brazil with Bolsonaro trying to do a coup and then almost getting out, and then Trump ending tariffs. Now, I'm not trying to dive into politics too much, but obviously with all that stuff going on, I would imagine that a student who's in a peace studies class, reading this, listening to you, saying, all right, this all sounds great, but what's going on around me? So how do you navigate that?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, John, because it's funny. It really resonates with part of what I was grappling with when I was doing my research for the book in Colombia. Because at the time in Colombia, I was there during the peace process. And, on some level, there was this great sense of we're trying to end decades of violence, right?
Yeah.
The FARC and the government. And, that's a violence that is so complicated because it involves, the drug trade, it involves the lack of state presence, it involves resource issues, all of this. But one of the things when I talk to young people that I think they struggle at times with was saying, well, I'm hearing this about, we need to be a more peaceful society, or I'm being taught in my school, you can lead a future peaceful Colombia, but it doesn't feel real to me, right? Because at the same time, I see this happening, or I understand the world in this way, or, I believe that it's all politics. And so I don't really believe in, what they're saying. It sounds nice, but it's not real. And I do wonder, and myself, I'm concerned a bit in our current moment for anyone who's doing the work with young people, whether it be college or in schools, K through 12 or any of that. If you're trying to give young people a sense of like, it matters to be ethical, it matters to treat other people well, and then out in this kind of macrosphere, using our like developmental theory kind of language, but out in society, what we're seeing in all these examples are that that's not really true. I do think young people, you kind of have two outcomes. One is they say, it all doesn't matter. And it's kind of this nihilistic, like, I can then just do whatever I want because everyone else is. Or they probably get a little disheartened. And, if they were going to be that sort of activist or that leader, they might say, I don't know if I can do that because, look, it just doesn't feel like it's real and that people care about it or that it would be valued or I'd be able to do anything.
Yeah, I suppose that the optimist in us would be all of that outside noise. It's more than noise, but all of that is problematic. But students tend to be a little more optimistic when they first start, whether it's high school or college. So maybe we can get them to sort of tune that out, if they can, and say, well, but I'm going to make a difference. So I think that's what I wanted to ask you about in Colombia specifically, because you mentioned you were there during the peace process. In your book, you talk about a peace education law that was signed or passed in 2015, and it mandated, this is fascinating to me, that all primary, secondary, and post-secondary schools include at least 2 of 12 broad peace-related themes in their curriculum, and that's justice and human rights, conflict resolution, historical memory, protection of the nation's cultural and natural resources. By the way, that issue, cultural resources, we do a lot of work with a group called the Antiquities Coalition, and that's part of what they work on, and that's to get cultural artifacts back to their countries, and the way that gets used to commit financial crime and that sort of thing. But given all that, it's been 10 years. How often, if at all, do you get back to Colombia? Do you hear how things are going? What's your take?
Yeah, so that's a fascinating connection, by the way, in the cultural artifacts. I do think, it's one of those interesting things where it's, something that young people are not always aware of, and then when it raises its level, they understand, right? It feeds in and connected to all these other complicated dynamics. But I'll start with saying, that peace education law was really sort of forward thinking, right? And part of it was because what was going on during that process that I was talking about was it was a political move, but I think it was also genuine in saying, we can't just sit down, the government, the FARC, and say, okay, we're going to come to a peace accord and the two of us are going to shake hands and everything's going to be great. Like, we need to actually also change some things going on in society. And one of the ways we're going to do this is to really focus on young people. And so it was political partly because then the president at the time, Santos, kind of tried to harness the young people to sort of support and lead some of his political efforts in this space. But it was also, I think, genuine, and the peace education law is a good example. Now, the complexity, even at the time that it was signed, was that, and if I say peace education to you, right, like, you maybe think of one thing, some people think of other things. You just named all those 12 themes.
Right.
Those 12 themes are really broad.
Yeah.
And then the Colombian education system is actually very decentralized. So the way it was played out was it said, okay, every school has to tell us what they're doing, but we can't mandate, a certain way of doing it, or we can't say that the way that you're doing it, isn't good enough. So I kind of, heard all these stories of you'd have some schools that would, do these really in-depth sort of like they change their curriculum and they would teach about peace processes and have debates in schools and all of this. And then you'd have other ones that used to have like a Little Miss, Sunshine or something, so like school pageant.
Right.
And then they changed it to be Little Miss Peace. And they said, okay, that checks our box. As time has passed, one of the complexities that I've really seen there is that the political dynamics in Colombia have made the broader peace efforts really difficult and complicated. And some of those are internal. They sort of switched from a president who was in support of this to a president who was sort of really against it. And then now they've had another president come in who you may have seen, in the news because he's all over. Even before the boat issues in the Caribbean, he was sort of fighting with Trump, and he's very leftist, and so he's created a lot of complications too. But so you have these political complications, and then what's ended up, I think, in schools is there's been a bit of sort of like a fizzling out. So a lot of those efforts that were started 6, 7, 8 years ago, they've either just sort of been forgotten or kind of pushed aside as you've had changes in ministry and all of that. Or, I do think amongst young people, there's been a bit of a sense of, well, okay, if you look at the history of our country, the last, just in the short term, the last 10 years, we don't see the change actually happening. Right. And if we don't see the change, then being told and taught that it's possible and that you're going to have a part in it, kind of sounds like it's hollow a bit.
What's your take of the population? What, even with the changes in administrations and the fact that some of these, from your definition, from your explanation, some of these schools sort of, like you say, check the box, others were really engaged in it. Is there still, I know you don't know everybody in the country, but is there still a sense of, lack of a better term, of optimism that we still need to be understanding peace? Or I don't know, what's your take? I can see people getting depressed about it because there was this movement 10 years ago and some of it was working out, and now, like you say, changes occurred. Not that different from here, where the educational system's been attacked in terms of teaching history, and again, we don't need to go in all that. I can see some students being very, if not depressed, very skeptical. So to the extent that you're connected back with folks there, what's your take? Is there still some hope, still some sense of optimism, do you think?
Yeah, and I should start, by saying that I do go back regularly. I work with some folks who are in this space who are deeply engaged in this kind of work. So, I do have a bit of a sense, even from the time that I really lived there and did the research, which was, again, almost a decade, a little under. So I think when you look at sort of surveys of Colombian citizens broadly, right, there is a lot of skepticism and a lot of probably loss of that hope that there might have been a decade ago. That being said, you raise a good point. You look across the whole world right now, I think we're seeing the reverberations of lost trust and faith. And maybe even optimism, right? And that there can be something better, that we can expect more from our government, that we can expect, a more positive future if we really are devoted to it. And you're seeing that play out in politics, and I think you're seeing it play out in, economics and all of that as well. But I would say in Colombia, what I've sort of seen is that, there are a lot of folks who are deeply committed to it, and a lot of them are still continuing, but it feels like it's less kind of raised to a level of recognizing and awarding and celebrating it as much. And so, you still have wonderful foundations that are rooted in doing peace education work, but they're maybe not getting as much attention, right? There's maybe not quite as much funding opportunities for them and all of that. And the way that filters down, I think, to individual young people is probably a sense that some of the localized peace efforts might work, right? So, you're working with young people, let's say in one given school, the interpersonal element, and it comes into the restorative justice, maybe, working through conflict between you and other people in your school. I think there's still a lot of like that resonating, and they'll engage with that. But I think there's a lot less hope that that kind of work will build to a society that's more peaceful, right? That can contribute to something beyond what's just going on between people in that context.
I liked when throughout the book you describe an issue, and then toward the end you have a characterization of why it matters. So people that are going to read through it will give sort of direction if they didn't pick it up through the discussion. Would say, here's all that's going on. Here's the pros and cons of what have you. Here's why it matters to the end goal. And the way you end the book, you make it clear that this is a beginning of extending a conversation. There's quite a bit else to do. I want to add two more things I want to ask you. One is there's a phrase you use called conceptualized peace.
Mm-hmm.
What is that? And then I do want you to spend a couple minutes talking about what you're doing in the Milwaukee school system, which I know isn't directly related to the book, but I thought that was interesting as well. I watched some of the stuff you posted on LinkedIn, and maybe give us an update on that. But first, what is conceptualized peace? What does that mean?
Yeah, I think, John, the first two things you were mentioning there are really well connected, because I tried to add the why it matters, because sometimes, I'm an academic, and we,
Right.
sit in sort of the ivory tower sometimes, or we spend a lot of time with big words or writing for journals. And so it was actually part of the exercise for me to be like, let's ground this. Why would this matter to someone reading it in a very succinct way? And that ties into the conceptualized piece, because that idea started for me as something in my dissertation, which was very much academic, right? I went to the University of Chicago. It's
Mhm.
renowned for, being kind of hoity-toity sort of academia.
Right.
And I respect that. I think there's a value. But really what conceptualized piece is kind of getting at is just, we use these ideas and these terms, like even you and I here, we've been talking about peace, but we might be thinking about really different things, right? For various reasons. Like, you might be thinking in the context of the type of work that you're doing, right? Some international economics and, let's say, human trafficking, right? And then I might be sitting here thinking about peace and thinking about like the conflict I'm having with my neighbor, right? Which actually I don't. I have pretty good relations with the neighbor. But but I mean, how we understand and conceptualize a term like peace really matters for even how we're going to start. And I think for young people, that's particularly important, because those developing ideas that they have, that intersects then with their sense of who am I and who am I going to be into the future. And so, a young person who sits there and says, peace to me means that we all sort of like get along interpersonally, but then through caring and respecting each other, we can build sort of a society in which people can thrive, in which people can be, feel calm and enjoy life, and have their human rights respected, things like that. Well, that young person is probably much more likely then to say, and that's something that I can be a part of. And if I think about my future, if I think about who I am, I'm going to connect into that. But the same young person who says, like, oh, all this talk about peace is just hollow because it's a politicized idea that people use to try and get votes, as they build their own identity, it's very unlikely, that they're going to say, oh, yeah, and so I'm going to really buy into what I'm hearing, about, peace education in a school, because there's going to be that sort of dissonance.
Right.
So conceptualized peace is just that. It's just starting with how young people understand an idea like peace or like justice. And then from there, we start to say, okay, what does this mean then for who they can be and how we can build support for them to really engage pro-socially in society. Uh, and that kind of connects in, I would say, a bit to the Milwaukee work in context. I think often about Colombia and Milwaukee being these two like radically different contexts,
Right.
but also, the kind of violence and talk about violence, and sometimes the struggles to be hopeful, that there's a peaceful future in Colombia. Those kind of resonate with some areas of Milwaukee, where you've had decades of disinvestment, you've had
Yeah.
struggles with violence, you've had talk for a long time about educational inequity, but very little change. And so, I sort of think of that as young people growing up in those settings, right? If you're trying to give them a sense of, hey, you can be a real change agent, or, if you really try hard and you succeed, it can contribute to making a change in your community. They may struggle with that, right? Because of all of that that's going on. Um, and so I'm really, interested always in those young people's perspectives in Milwaukee for similar reasons. What does it mean to be a young person who wants to do something really good for a community in a Milwaukee context where it's been really challenging to make change? Um, and concretely, that plays out. I work with Milwaukee Public Schools,
Mhm.
trying to support some of their work. So they have a Office of Restorative Practices that's doing some really incredible work, to try and reduce suspensions and expulsions. But also when you talk with them, what they're trying to do is get kids excited about being in school, develop kids' leadership so that they're helping navigate conflict in their school, which can then extend out to them being leaders in conflict resolution and repairing harm out in the community too.
And I know that the center works with the Near West Side Partners as well, and it's among other things an economic goals to improve areas of Milwaukee, so that when small businesses do enter there or they succeed, that helps both reduce crime, but obviously adds jobs and that sort of thing. And that's all leading to, keeping people engaged in the community. I think that's important. So the center, obviously you're involved with that as well. That's all pretty important. Well, let me get you out of here on this and just remind folks that the book is The Making Meaning of Justice and Peace, a Developmental Lens. Dr. Velez, it just came out a few months ago. You can get it on Amazon and other places. Let me get you out of here on this one. You are optimistic to a degree, right?
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
What is the best what is the best recommendation you could have for any of us, whether we have kids or grandkids in school, just in terms of continuing to encourage engagement and understanding peace?
Yeah, I might just say starting really basically with understanding where they're at right now. I think too often we think of the things that we're doing with them as supporting the kind of outcomes we want, right? And, I'll give you a quick context in the school. If we develop a peace education curriculum and let's say we teach about like perspective taking, we think like, great, right? Like we've got this idea of perspective taking. It's great. We're going to have them, learn it, and then they're going to be more empathetic. Well, the problem there is that we're doing that from our perspective as adults. And even though the end goal matters and we're like from a good place developing that support, you might have a young person sitting there being like, why, like this doesn't resonate with me, I don't care about this. And so I think we need to do that work to sit and be like, how are they understanding their world? How are they understanding what it means to be peaceful, what it means to be engaged in violence, and even what you're talking about, all these things in the news, right? Is it resonating with them? Do they think that, it doesn't matter for you to be ethical because look at all the people who are not and are getting away with all these things? Right. What is their sense of that? And then from there, kind of do the work to maybe try and support them in, building the types of skills and attitudes and ways of being in the world that we know contribute to a more peaceful world.
Dr. Velez, thank you, Gabe, so much for the time today. Again, people should both read the book and then follow you on LinkedIn. I've seen some excellent posts and information both on what you're doing in Milwaukee in general, and of course, the Center for Peacemaking has their website and their newsletter, and people should follow them as well. So thanks so much for taking the time today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. It's been great to be here, and I love this conversation.